In my whole career, I've never seen anything like this.
The doors were closed, the phones were gone, and the people inside believed every word spoken about Prince Harry would remain buried behind palace walls. They were wrong, because royal staff have now leaked the private exchange that allegedly froze a coronation summit in its tracks, not a discussion about where Harry would sit, not merely whether he would attend, but a whispered judgment about whether the king's younger son could ever again be trusted inside the monarchy's most protected circle. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had entered the confidential summit expecting an argument about logistics. Instead, the king found himself listening to advisors draw a brutal distinction between Harry the son and Harry the trusted royal. The Coronation Summit, a private planning meeting used here to decide access, ceremony, photographs, and sensitive arrangements surrounding the crowning carried consequences far beyond seating. Camilla listened as the discussion moved toward restricted areas and advance briefings. William sat rigidly nearby, knowing every concession would be measured against everything that had already fractured between the brothers. The leak emerged through a documented account compiled from 2 staff members who were present during the private discussion. One courtier recalled the sentence that changed the room, spoken barely above a whisper: "He can come for his father. He cannot come inside the trust." Charles did not answer immediately. He placed his pen beside the papers and stared at the table. The monarch was being asked to accept that welcoming Harry as his child did not mean restoring him to the confidential world surrounding the crown. William refused to soften the distinction simply because it hurt. When someone suggested wider access might demonstrate reconciliation, the prince answered that reconciliation could not require everyone else to ignore what had already happened. His anger remained controlled, but the point was unmistakable. Harry could be treated with dignity. Trust, however, could not be restored by ceremony alone. Camilla watched the argument tighten around Charles. The Queen understood that every option wounded him differently. Excluding Harry further risked making a family fracture permanent. Bringing him back into sensitive conversations risked reopening fears the household had spent months trying to contain. Then an aide quietly moved Harry's briefing folder away from the papers reserved for working royals. No announcement followed. None was needed. That tiny action made the separation real. Blood remained. Institutional confidence did not. But before the meeting ended, someone objected. Not because they believed Harry had done nothing wrong, but because they feared the palace was turning a damaged relationship into a permanent identity. And that objection would expose what Charles, William, Camilla, and Harry each stood to lose if the younger son was pushed one step further outside the royal circle. This was never simply Harry against the palace. Inside that summit sat a father terrified of losing his younger son completely, an heir determined to protect the institution he would one day inherit, a queen who remembered every public accusation made against her, and an absent prince whose name still had the power to alter the temperature of a room thousands of miles away. Every person carried history into that meeting. Nobody entered emotionally neutral. Charles felt the contradiction more sharply than anyone. The king wanted Harry present at the coronation because, beneath every title and every fracture, he was still his son. But the sovereign, the person who formally occupies the throne and carries ultimate responsibility for the monarchy, also had to protect confidential royal business. That meant fatherhood and kingship were pulling in opposite directions. Charles wanted inclusion without another explosion, and he knew there might be no version of that choice that left everyone unharmed. William carried a different burden. The prince was not thinking only as an older brother who had been hurt. He was thinking as the future king, aware that every precedent created now could shape how private conversations were protected during his own reign. When Charles glanced toward him, after Harry's access was questioned, William did not look away. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The silence said enough. They understood the same danger, but they disagreed over how much institutional risk family loyalty should be allowed to absorb. Camilla carried history of her own into the room. The Queen remembered how private tensions had escaped into interviews, headlines, and global conversations. She sat back when Harry's name surfaced again and folded her hands tightly, determined not to turn the meeting toward herself. But Charles noticed the tension. William noticed it too. She could separate herself from the decision in words, but not from the memories attached to it. Charles finally tried to preserve one personal space. The king proposed inviting Harry to a small family gathering, separate from official planning. His tone changed when he said it. The suggestion sounded less like strategy and more like a father asking the room to leave him one place where his younger son could simply be his son. William did not reject that. The prince agreed Harry should not be humiliated or treated as an enemy. But he drew a line that shocked the room. Private family inclusion could not automatically restore institutional access. Affection and trust were no longer the same thing. That firmness had not been born inside the summit. William had reached it earlier, after one specific private incident convinced him that reconciliation alone could no longer protect the palace. And once that moment happened, confrontation at the Coronation Summit was almost inevitable. Weeks before the summit, there had been one final attempt to keep the family problem inside the family. No cameras, no grand announcement, no constitutional language. Just a private dinner conversation at Windsor, in which Charles urged William to consider whether Harry could be brought closer during the coronation period. It should have been a moment of repair. Instead, one sentence transformed the discussion and became the trigger everyone inside the later summit would remember when Harry's name was raised. Charles raised the idea carefully. The king asked whether Harry could be included in a restricted family gathering and given selected ceremonial details in advance as a gesture of trust. A restricted gathering meant a private event with limited access, usually involving only close family or senior participants rather than the wider ceremonial party. William did not dismiss the proposal immediately. The prince asked what information his brother would receive, who else would be present, and whether the invitation was meant to rebuild a personal relationship or restore institutional confidence. Charles answered as a father, before he answered as a sovereign. The king told his elder son that the coronation might be one of the few remaining occasions powerful enough to remind Harry that he still belonged to the family. His voice stayed low, but the fear underneath it was unmistakable. William understood what his father was asking. This was not really about one dinner or one briefing. Charles was terrified that another rejection could turn distance into something permanent. William sat with the question for a long moment. Then the prince gave the answer that changed everything. I can forgive my brother and still refuse to gamble everyone else's privacy. Charles looked down instead of responding. The king heard both halves of the sentence. William was not refusing forgiveness. He was refusing to treat forgiveness as proof that trust had returned. Emotionally, the dinner ended there, even though neither man immediately left the table. Days later, the disagreement became impossible to keep theoretical. Palace staff preparing coronation access lists the internal plans identifying who could enter restricted areas and receive sensitive scheduling information, discovered uncertainty over what Harry should be told in advance. A senior aide asked whether private movements and intimate gatherings should be shared with him. William's warning had suddenly become an operational problem. Charles refused to let staff turn that concern into policy without another family discussion. The king ordered them not to finalize any exclusion until the issue could be addressed together. That decision created the need for the confidential coronation summit itself. So when William entered that later room, he was not deciding from scratch. Charles already knew exactly where his son stood. At Windsor, father and heir had disagreed quietly. Inside the summit, with Camilla and senior aides listening, quiet disagreement would no longer be enough. There are royal arguments built on shouting, and there are others made more brutal by how little anyone raises their voice. This was the second kind. When the summit reached the question of Harry's private access, Charles attempted one last compromise. William listened, waited, and then answered his father directly. What followed was not simply a disagreement about the coronation. It was an older brother admitting that love had survived where confidence had not. Charles tried to keep the discussion from becoming absolute. The king proposed giving Harry limited advance information about private receptions, family movements, and restricted gatherings, so his younger son would not arrive feeling deliberately humiliated. Restricted access meant entry to smaller royal events and sensitive planning not available to every guest. To Charles, the compromise was about dignity. To William, it risked turning emotional guilt into a rule the institution would then be expected to defend. William turned directly toward his father. The prince said that giving someone confidential access merely to prove affection was exactly how personal guilt could become institutional weakness. Charles stiffened immediately. The king asked whether his son was accusing him of acting from guilt. William did not retreat. He said Harry was still his brother and would always be his brother, but that was precisely why drawing the boundary hurt. If there had been no love left, the decision would have been easier. Charles answered with the one fact nobody in the room could challenge. Harry remained his son regardless of what had happened publicly. The king's voice stayed controlled, but fatherhood had broken through the protocol. William understood the pain, yet refused to let it settle the question. He told Charles that being family and being trusted with sensitive royal planning were no longer automatically the same thing. Camilla finally entered the argument. The queen said the palace could not create one standard for people it feared upsetting, and another for everyone else. Charles looked toward her and realized the disagreement had expanded beyond father and son. The room was no longer asking whether Harry deserved kindness. It was asking whether kindness could be confused with restored confidence. Then came the sentence later preserved in the staff account. A senior royal figure said quietly that Harry could be welcomed as family, but he could not automatically be welcomed back into trust. Nobody challenged the distinction. Charles accepted temporary restrictions, but he refused to let them become a permanent verdict on his younger son. And that resistance opened the next battle. Because even the king was about to discover that some parts of the royal machine could not be moved by affection alone. A crown creates enormous authority, but it does not erase consequences. Once the summit separated Harry's position as Charles's son from his position inside royal confidence, the king faced an uncomfortable truth. He could invite his child, embrace him, speak privately with him, and insist he be treated with dignity. What Charles could not do without consequences was force everyone else to behave as though trust had never been damaged. Charles tested that limit almost immediately. The king asked a senior courtier whether Harry could simply be returned to the normal briefing circulation. Briefing circulation means the controlled flow of confidential schedules, movements, and planning information shared with people who need it for official duties. The aide hesitated before answering that a direct order could override the existing judgment, but it would look less like reconciliation and more like the sovereign forcing staff to ignore risks they had already identified. Charles removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The king admitted that he did not want the coronation remembered by Harry as the moment his own family formally classified him as an outsider. That fear went deeper than ceremony. The monarch could control invitations and shape the atmosphere around the weekend, but senior officials still carried responsibility for protected movements and sensitive logistics. William also controlled information coming from the Prince of Wales' household, especially where his own family and future planning were concerned. William refused to let those restrictions become theatrical. The prince was told that Harry might receive a visibly different briefing pack from other senior participants. He objected immediately. If access needed to be limited, he said, then the limitation should happen quietly. No marked folder, no humiliating seating device, no unnecessary signal designed to make his brother feel publicly demoted. The future king wanted a boundary, not a spectacle. Charles understood the distinction, even if he hated needing it. The king agreed that Harry would attend as his son and as Duke of Sussex, a royal title held by the monarch's younger son, but restricted family planning and confidential discussions would no longer be available automatically. Access would be granted only when there was a clear reason for him to receive it. The language sounded careful. The consequence was not. Once the principal reached the staff arranging the coronation weekend, one small change was made to Harry's movements. A door he had once expected to walk through without question was no longer automatically open. And when he discovered that change, the family would learn that quiet restrictions could wound just as deeply as public rejection. Harry had prepared himself for awkwardness. What he had not prepared for was precision. There would be no dramatic ban, no public rebuke, no humiliating announcement. His place at the coronation remained. His family connection remained. Yet behind the ceremony, the architecture of trust had quietly changed. And when the Duke learned that one private gathering would proceed without him, the absence said more than any official statement ever could. Harry saw the change while reviewing his arrangements. The schedule still placed him at the coronation service, but one restricted post-service gathering was missing from his movements. A restricted gathering simply meant a private event limited to working royals and those directly involved in official planning. The palace had deliberately avoided any public signal of punishment. His treatment would remain courteous, his title unchanged, and no announcement would explain the omission. But the silence around the change made its meaning impossible to miss. Harry asked whether the family gathering had been cancelled. The answer came quietly, no. It was still taking place. The Duke said nothing for several seconds. Then he closed the schedule and stopped asking questions. That reaction unsettled the aide delivering the explanation, because there was no anger to manage, no accusation to answer, only recognition. Harry understood that he was being welcomed into the ceremony as Charles's son, while being kept outside the inner circle that once treated him as part of its confidential world. Charles learned about the reaction soon afterward. The king listened as an aide explained that Harry had understood immediately what the missing invitation meant. He looked toward the window and said only, "I never wanted him to discover it like that." The monarch had supported the boundary, but this was the first moment he felt its emotional weight in something concrete. A policy had become his son closing a page, because there was nothing left to ask. Harry then began discussing an earlier departure after the ceremony. Officially, the change could still be explained as scheduling. Privately, it carried another meaning. The Duke saw little reason to remain once the formal role ended. If he was welcome for duty, but not for the family space around it, staying longer only extended the discomfort. William heard that his brother had not protested. The prince had prepared himself for anger, perhaps even another confrontation. Instead, Harry's silence unsettled him. Resentment could still be argued with. Silence felt more final. Late that evening, William asked Charles for a private conversation. No aides, no briefing papers, no Camilla. The palace had solved its security problem. Now father and son had to decide whether they had created a family wound neither truly wanted. When Charles and William met again, the summit table was gone. So were the advisors, folders, and carefully neutral phrases. There were only two men confronting the consequences of a decision neither could pretend was painless. The king had protected the institution without protecting Harry from hurt. The prince had defended trust without feeling victorious. And in that stripped-down conversation, father and son finally stopped debating access and began admitting what they were actually afraid of losing. Charles had asked for the meeting privately because he no longer wanted officials turning emotion into policy language. There were no aides in the room and no briefing papers between them. A briefing paper is simply a written summary used to guide official decisions, but neither man wanted guidance now. They already agreed the restriction around Harry was necessary. What remained was harder, whether protecting confidential royal business also meant accepting emotional exile as the unavoidable price. Charles spoke first. The king admitted that every protective decision seemed to push his younger son farther away personally. He said becoming sovereign had not made fatherhood easier. It had made every failure more visible. The monarch could defend the institution from uncertainty, but he could not stop himself wondering whether Harry experienced every boundary as another message that there was less and less room left for him inside the family. William answered with an admission he rarely allowed himself. The prince said anger was easier than acknowledging how much he missed the brother he had once trusted instinctively. Keeping sensitive information from Harry was not revenge, he told his father. Revenge would have brought satisfaction. This brought none. It was simply what remained when affection survived after confidence had been broken. Charles then asked the question that stripped away every excuse. If nobody outside the family ever discovered the restrictions, would William still insist on them? The king watched his son carefully, because the answer would reveal whether the boundary was driven by principle or resentment. Yes, William answered immediately. That certainty changed something for Charles. The king understood that his elder son was not trying to humiliate Harry or win a public argument. He genuinely believed trust had to be rebuilt rather than ceremonially restored. William offered one concession. The prince said Harry should receive a private message before the coronation, making one thing unmistakable. Whatever restrictions existed around royal business, his place as Charles's son was not conditional. For a moment, father and son had finally found a distinction they could both live with, but they would not be allowed to keep it private. Staff whispers were already escaping the palace, and soon the words meant only for closed rooms would become a global headline everyone believed they understood. By morning, the private summit was no longer private. The words about Harry had escaped their guarded room and entered television studios, breakfast tables, and crowds outside royal gates. Suddenly, a family distinction that had taken hours to negotiate was reduced to one devastating phrase: "Welcome as a son, excluded from trust." The palace had feared another public confrontation with the Duke. Instead, it now faced something more dangerous: a nation watching the monarchy expose the difference between forgiveness and confidence. Charles received the morning papers, knowing immediately which story mattered. The leaked staff account of the Coronation Summit had dominated coverage, with commentators focusing on Harry's family status and the loss of automatic access to confidential royal discussions. Royal Communications, the palace staff responsible for official public messaging, refused to confirm the private exchange in detail. The strategy was deliberate. Turning a family argument into an official accusation would only deepen the fracture. But silence could not stop the words from spreading. Charles stopped at one front page. Across it ran the enormous headline, "Welcome home, but not inside." The king folded the paper once and asked whether Harry had seen it. His concern was immediate, because the carefully drawn distinction was never meant to become public humiliation. The monarch had wanted his son protected from spectacle. Now the entire country was interpreting the boundary for him. William reacted with anger for a different reason. The prince told an aide that every decision inside the summit had been designed to avoid embarrassing his brother. No marked folder, no public rebuke, no dramatic exclusion. Yet the leak had transformed private reasoning into national entertainment. The future king had defended a principle, but seeing that principle reduced to a headline left him feeling exposed rather than vindicated. Outside Buckingham Palace, the argument became visible. Journalists broadcast live as a small crowd gathered near the gates, and one placard appeared repeatedly across television coverage: "Family can forgive. Trust must be earned." The phrase captured the distinction the family had struggled to express privately, and suddenly strangers were debating whether the monarchy had shown cruelty or restraint. Harry gave them no new explosion. The Duke issued no attack, no recorded rebuttal, and no angry public statement. His silence changed the mood. Without a counterstrike, attention drifted away from battle and toward sadness. Charles noticed it. William noticed it too. The coronation was approaching, and another summit could solve nothing. The final answer would not come from another leak, briefing, or headline. It would come from what father and sons chose to do once there was nothing left to argue about. When the noise finally faded, the truth left behind was more complicated than victory or defeat. Harry had not been erased from the royal family. Charles had not stopped loving his son. William had not demanded permanent exile. Yet the summit had established something the monarchy could no longer avoid. Blood could guarantee a place in the family, but it could not guarantee access to confidence. That distinction wounded everyone involved, but by coronation morning, it had become the line none of them were prepared to pretend did not exist. Charles made sure the final arrangement carried that distinction clearly. Harry would attend the coronation with his royal identity intact, but he would not automatically return to confidential working royal circles. A working royal circle means the group directly involved in official duties, sensitive planning, and private institutional discussions on behalf of the crown. The king did not reverse the summit because he understood that family reconciliation and professional trust were no longer the same thing. William understood it too. Neither man wanted humiliation. Neither was willing to pretend nothing had changed. Charles refused to let caution become rejection. Before the ceremony, the king ensured that a private message reached his younger son, making one point unmistakable. The restrictions concerned royal confidence, not paternal love. Harry was still wanted as family. He was still his son. The monarch knew that if this distinction remained unspoken, every restricted doorway could begin to feel like evidence of something much harsher. William learned that the message had been delivered and did not object. The prince no longer saw personal reassurance as weakening the boundary he had defended. Instead, he recognized something more difficult. Protecting the future of the institution and leaving room for healing could exist together. Harry remained his brother, even if trust no longer moved automatically between them. Harry chose not to challenge the coronation arrangement publicly. The Duke attended without demanding that ceremony pretend the deeper fracture had already healed. That decision carried meaning of its own. He could stand within the royal family without claiming the old confidence had magically returned. And that gave the leaked sentence its final meaning. He can come for his father. He cannot come inside the trust. Was never ultimately a declaration of banishment. It was an admission that reconciliation and restoration were different things. The summit did not destroy Harry's place in the House of Windsor. It defined it. Charles remained his father. William remained his brother. Harry remained family. But trust, once granted almost automatically through birth and duty, had become something that would now have to be rebuilt through action. Painful as that was, the boundary finally gave everyone something years of conflict had denied them: honesty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.